All right, everybody, you ready to get into it? We are going deep today with Freakonomics.
This book is wild. It's like they took everything you thought you knew about economics and flipped the script.
You know, it's funny you should say that because that's exactly what Freakonomics does. It takes these everyday mysteries, like things you wouldn't even think twice about, and uses data to unpack them. It's not even always about money. Really, it's more about incentives, like what makes people pick.
Yeah, okay, I'm with you. So, like, take drug dealers, for example. In movies, they're always flashing cash, living large. But Levitt actually embeds himself with this crack gang in Chicago. And let me tell you, what he finds is way more complicated.
It's not all champagne and caviar, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Turns out the drug trade is a lot like any other industry cutthroat competition, a very clear hierarchy. And for those on the bottom rung, well, let's just say they're not exactly living the high life. So much for the glamorous gangster life, huh? It's more about survival than anything. And speaking of assumptions, let's talk about the crime drop in the 90s. Everybody had a theory back then.
Oh, yeah. All the experts were coming out of the woodwork, crediting new policing strategies, a booming economy, you name it.
But Levitt being Levitt, he's like, hold on a second, let's look at the data. And what he found, well, kind of threw everyone for a loop.
You could say that again. He found a link between legalized abortion and the falling crime rate.
And suddenly everyone's worldview just got rocked.
It's definitely a controversial topic, there's no denying that. But Levitt's point is that this wasn't some random coincidence. He argued that legalized abortion led to fewer children being born into difficult circumstances, kids who statistically might have been more likely to end up caught in the system later in life.
Okay, so we've got drug dealers who aren't rolling in dough and a cram drop linked to something totally unexpected. What other surprises does Freakonomics have in store for us?
Well, next up, we're diving into this idea of information asymmetry, which is a fancy way of saying who knows what and how that knowledge, whether it's about real estate or even something crazy like the Ku Klux Klan, can really tilt the scales.
Hold up real estate and the KKK. Now, I've heard it all.
Yeah.
How do those two even go together?
It all comes down to the power of information. Think about it. Real estate agents, they're supposed to help you right, but they also have their own interests to consider. And Levitt found that they consistently get better prices on their own homes than they do for their clients. Why? Because they're holding on to key pieces of information that give them the upper hand.
So they're kind of like gatekeepers of knowledge. And that knowledge equals power.
Bingo! And that actually reminds me of this incredible story about a guy named Stetson Kennedy. He was a writer who infiltrated the KKK back in the 1940s. And get this, he used their biggest weapon, secrecy, against them.
Okay, now you've got to tell me more. How do you even begin to dismantle a group like the KKK with information?
It's brilliant, actually. He took their secret rituals, their ridiculous passwords, all that stuff, and he shared it with children's radio shows. So you've got these kids on the playground innocently repeating KKK lingo. It totally diffused their power, turning their whole scary mystique into a joke.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
He leveled the playing field by making their information public. Kind of like what the internet has done with so much information today. So we're starting to see a theme here. Things aren't always what they seem, and information is power. But what about something a little closer to home? What about parenting?
Parenting. The ultimate minefield Freakonomics doesn't shy away from the tough questions there either. Like, how much does school choice really matter?
You're telling me all those hours parents spend researching schools, agonizing over the right fit, could be for nothing.
Well, not necessarily. There was this fascinating study done in Chicago that looked at kids who switched schools. And while they found that switching schools was often correlated with a higher chance of graduating, it wasn't actually the school itself that made the biggest difference. It was the parents' initiative.
So the parents who were actively engaged in their child's education, who were willing to go the extra mile to find the best fit for them, that drive was the real key.
Exactly. The study found that just the act of opting out of their assigned school, regardless of where they ended up, often meant those parents were more involved, more invested, and that translated into higher motivation for the students themselves.
Okay, so once again, it's not the obvious answer. It's about digging deeper, seeing the story behind the data. What about all those parents who swear by baby Mozart tapes and flashcards for their infants?
That's where a huge study called the ECLS comes in. They tracked thousands of kids, and what they discovered about success, well, let's just say it might surprise you.
All right, I'm ready for another Freakonomics twist. Hit me with it.
So they found that things like socioeconomic status, family structure, even a child's birth weight, those factors tended to have a much stronger correlation with a child's academic success than any particular parenting techniques.
So all those Baby Einstein DVDs might not actually be turning our kids into geniuses after all.
Right. It's more a case of correlation, not causation. Educated parents tend to buy more books, but it's not necessarily the books themselves that are making the difference. It's the environment they're creating, the value they place on learning.
Makes you think, huh? But we've only scratched the surface of Freakonomics. Remember how we were talking about information being power? Well, get ready to have your mind blown because even something as simple as a name can be packed with hidden information.
Oh, absolutely. Levitt and Dubner, they really went deep into the world of baby names, and what they found is both hilarious and kind of mind-boggling. They analyzed data from California, which, let's face it, is basically a giant petri dish of baby names.
I mean, it's California. What
Right.
else would it be?
Exactly, and they found that names often follow these predictable paths through different social groups. It's like trickle-down economics, but for baby names.
Okay, now you've got to explain that one to me. How does that even work? So are you telling me like rich people just invent a name out of thin air and then it like trickles down the social ladder?
It's more like this. You've got high-income families, right? They're often drawn to names that are distinctive, unique, maybe something that sounds elegant or sophisticated. Then, as those names become more popular, they kind of spread to middle-income families and eventually to lower-income families. But here's the catch. By the time a name reaches widespread popularity, it's already lost its luster among those high-income trendsetters. They've already moved on to something new.
So it's like this never-ending cycle of parents trying to stay ahead of the curve,
Yeah.
always searching for that perfect name that says, my kid is special.
You got it. And Freakonomics doesn't shy away from asking the tough questions here. Like, do these name choices actually have any impact on a child's life?
That's what I want to know. Does naming your kid Winner actually set them up for a more successful life?
Well, they talk about these two brothers, one named Winner and the other, get this, named Loser.
You've got to be kidding me. You can't make this stuff up.
Right, it's almost too perfect. But here's the thing. Their lives took completely different paths. Winner ended up having a lot of run-ins with the law, while Loser actually became a police sergeant.
Talk about irony. So does that mean a name has no power at all?
It's not quite that simple. Freakonomics suggests that while a name might not determine your destiny, it can be a powerful indicator of these social and economic factors that often get passed down through generations. For example, their analysis of the California data showed that girls with distinctly Black names were statistically more likely to experience lower economic outcomes.
So it's not the name itself that's the problem, but what that name represents about their background and the opportunities they're likely to have.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that even within the same socioeconomic group, names go through these cycles of popularity.
Oh, totally. Like, remember a few years ago when every other baby seemed to be named Sophia or Aiden? It's like, what is driving these trends?
Well, like we were saying before, it seems like those higher income families are often the trendsetters when it comes to baby names.
So it all comes back to that trickle-down effect. The names that were once seen as posh and exclusive eventually become so mainstream that nobody wants to use them anymore.
Precisely. And as a name becomes more common, it loses its appeal among those at the top, who then move on to the next it name. It's like this constant game of social one-upmanship played out in birth announcements and playground roll calls.
This is blowing my mind.
Yeah.
So if names really do carry all this social baggage, should we just ditch the name books altogether? Like, should we start naming our kids table and chair to avoid all this social signaling?
I think Freakonomics would argue that it's not about trying to erase all social indicators from a name. It's more about being aware of the subtle ways in which our choices, even seemingly insignificant ones like a name, can reflect and reinforce these larger societal patterns.
So it's less about finding the perfect name and more about understanding this complex interplay between our individual choices and the world around us.
Exactly. It's about being mindful of the messages we might be sending intentionally or not, and having these open and honest conversations about the factors that shape opportunity and perception.
This has been a wild ride so far. I feel like I'm seeing the world through a whole new lens. Before we wrap up our deep dive into Freakonomics, I have one more burning question.
Mm.
We've talked about crime, real estate, parenting, even maybe names.
Hmm.
What's the one big takeaway from Freakonomics that you want our listeners to walk away with?
You know, if I had to pick just one, it'd be that Freakonomics is a call to action. It's about being skeptical, questioning everything.
Yeah, like don't just accept things at face value. Dig deeper. Look for those hidden connections.
Exactly. It's about peeling back the layers of assumptions and biases and really trying to understand the why behind the what.
And sometimes that why can be found in the most unexpected places. Like, who knew you could learn so much about economics from studying a crack gang in Chicago?
Right. But that's Levitt in a nutshell. He's not afraid to get his hands dirty, to go to those unconventional places to find answers. And what he discovered about that crack gang, it really challenges our perceptions.
Okay, so spill it. Were they all living large like we see in the movies?
Not even close. In fact, what they found was that the drug trade, for all its illegal activity, it's not that different from a lot of legitimate businesses.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. You've got your hierarchy or your chain of command,
Yeah.
and just like in a big corporation, the real money is made at the top.
So we're talking about the kingpins,
Yeah.
the shot callers.
Exactly. They're the ones raking in the profits, while the street-level dealers, the ones putting themselves at risk every day, they're often barely scraping by.
Man, that's kind of depressing when you think about it. These young people, often from tough backgrounds, risking their lives for a system that's designed to keep them down.
It's a sobering reminder that incentives drive behavior, even in the most desperate of circumstances.
And speaking of incentives, Freakonomics has this great story about a daycare center in Israel that tried to solve the problem of parents showing up late to pick up their kids.
Oh, yeah. This is a classic example of good intentions gone wrong. They figured, hey, let's hit them where it hurts, right? Their wallets. So they started issuing fines for late pickups, thinking that would motivate people to be more punctual.
Makes sense to me. I mean,
Yeah.
nobody wants to pay extra, right?
Right. You'd think so. But here's the kicker. Late pickups actually went up after they introduced the fines.
Wait, seriously. But that makes no sense. Why would anyone be more likely to be late if it meant paying a penalty?
It all comes down to psychology. Before the fines, most parents saw being on time as a matter of respect for the daycare workers' time. It was a social contract. But once that financial penalty was introduced, it kind of changed the equation.
So instead of feeling guilty about being late, they just felt like they were paying for a service.
Exactly. The fine, in a way, legitimized their lateness. It took away the moral dilemma and turned it into a simple transaction.
Wow, that is fascinating. It just goes to show you even the smallest changes can have these huge unintended consequences, especially when you're dealing with human behavior.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Freakonomics so captivating. It forces us to confront our assumptions about how the world works, to consider alternative explanations, to stay open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
It's like that saying, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know.
You couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it. Curiosity keeps us engaged. It keeps us learning. It keeps us from getting stuck in our own little echo chambers.
Well said. This deep dive into Freakonomics has been a wild ride, that's for sure. I feel like I'm seeing the world through a whole new lens.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
Likewise.
Yeah.
And for all you listeners out there, if there's one thing to take away from Freakonomics, it's this. Stay curious. Keep asking questions. And never underestimate the power of a good data deep dive. You never know what hidden connections you might uncover.
Here.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.